Welcome back. Today we're going to be discussing Chapter 2 of Energies and Patterns in Psychological Type by Dr. John Beebe. Chapter 2 is called Once More with Feeling. And in the last chapter we talked about introverted feeling and extroverted feeling. Well, this chapter is more sort of about feeling proper. The chapter is centered around a speech given by Mary Louise von France. She's considered the closest analytical follower of Jung, and the speech was given in 1986, so we'll start there. It's important to know that her speech was unlike any other speech that Beebe had ever seen. She is an introverted thinking type, but in this speech, she was giving it all from the perspective of extroverted feeling, her inferior function. Now, at first, Beebe was sort of taken aback by this and assumed that, in her elder age, she was 71, that she had sort of become blinded by believing that she kind of knew all and that she could sort of just give this very emotional sort of speech. As she continued on, Beebe came to realize that she actually was performing. She was performing a feeling function in its total. She was completely letting go of thinking. Carl Jung called this sacrificium intellecti, which means sort of what it sounds like. It's sacrificing the intellect, right? She was just reacting emotionally to the state of feeling in our civilization, in our culture. So her aim was to perform the feeling function and to commentate on how she feels like we've let feeling out of our discussion in psychology and in type. When feeling is let loose like this and isn't hindered at all by the thinking, it can cause the person to think in a completely new way. Acting out the feeling decency, that's what she calls it, feeling decency, doesn't necessarily lend itself to receiving anything back, right? It's sort of considered foolish or unwise to be a decent feeler, to have compassion for people and to lead with that. Beebe continues on with this whole narrative of how feeling can be used in a really effective way with his example of the shoe shiners. So Beebe would get his shoes shined in San Francisco where he lived. And he got them done in the middle of the street by these two guys. One was an introverted feeler, one was an extroverted feeler. And the introverted feeler was very quiet. He was he kind of shooed people away that were bothering his customers. The extroverted feeling type, he was a little bit different. He kind of he was sort of in touch with the people around him and the culture around him. So a specific instance that happened to Beebe, he was getting his shoes shined when a guy named Nick, who he didn't know, starts coming down the street and is mumbling incoherently and just seems kind of out of it. Beebe was made nervous by this, thinking that maybe this guy was going to be out of control, perhaps he was going to turn violent. Extroverted feeling shoe shiner, noticing Beebe's sort of fear in that moment, reaches out and says, "Nick, come on over here." And he sort of reaches out to him, and all of a sudden Nick starts to become more coherent and explains that a check that he was supposed to receive today didn't come in. And Beebe really took this experience to heart because, he was in his mind trying to think, okay, trying to understand what do I do in this situation? Whereas the shoe shiner just kind of reached out with his feeling and said, okay, Nick's not doing too well. Let me bring him into the fold. And that was curative in and of itself. Another point that Beebe makes in this chapter is that you can sit with a client and try to understand their situation and with cold hard logic try to figure out the best way to move forward and all of that. But sometimes when all of that doesn't work and you're not able to reach the client, feeling can be the most potent medicine. Just genuinely being with the person, feeling what they're feeling, staying with them in that moment. In discussing feeling, especially in the example of the shoe shiners, Beebe discusses this idea of introverted feeling and extroverted feeling coming together into something like appreciation. So introverted feeling being somebody that's judging and establishing the value, extroverted feeling somebody that's affirming, right, and relating. They come together into what would be appreciation. And the example he gives is the person that's establishing the value of the work that they're doing. They're able to appreciate the work that they've finished. And then the extroverted feeler, after they've, sort of had a nice interaction with someone, or can appreciate the work of someone else, they're affirming that. It comes back to this idea of appreciation. We sort of head in from this discussion of the importance of feeling into this idea of balance among feeling. Feeling as far as not really thinking introverted or extroverted, but more so feeling too little versus feeling too much. Feeling can be something that builds a bridge between people. But it's warned about in this chapter that you don't want to be someone that's, trying to get to know everything about somebody. That can cause resentment. That can make someone feel like, geez, let things unfold naturally. But at the same time, if you're too reserved and you don't want to be vulnerable in any sense, allow any feeling to kind of come out, then it's hard to reach that person as well. And something Beebe said that I really like is that every relationship has its optimum distance. I think it's an important thing to note that there is distance in all relationships. All healthy relationships have a certain distance to them. And that's important. So I like the idea of balance in this chapter. And I think feeling should balance out thinking. Just because this is sort of a conceptual area of a field, right? This isn't like music where and even music has kind of a thinking aspect and can be too much into the thinking aspect with people that are sort of snobs about music theory. There's a balance, right? There's rocking out at your favorite concert, not thinking and just enjoying it, and then there's understanding the theory. Similarly in psychology, right? There's understanding all of those definitions and concepts, and then there's the application, which requires you to be present and human with the people you're interacting with. An example of how we can sort of see balance outside of this thinking and feeling dynamic is in, of course, sensing and intuition. Intuition lives in the idea realm. We're imagining, right? We're enabling. It's all conceptual. Sensing is a lot more about here and now. What am I engaged in? What am I accounting for in my environment? So, again, this is another great dynamic. We live in a sensing-dominated world. And if we fall too far into sensing, it's kind of rigid, right? We're a little bit too locked in. We don't really see the playing of the imaginations. Whereas if we're too far into the imagination sort of idea, and a lot of us can become that way, a lot of us intuitives can kind of become that way, then we lose grip of what's going on in the here and now around us. The two sort of need to come into balance at some point. And with all of these types, that's sort of the message that I'm receiving is, number one, people perceive the world differently than you, right? Because they might be of a different type. There's 1,000 other reasons why somebody would perceive the world differently from you, but that's a big one, in my view, is that we perceive the world differently. So give each other grace when they're perceiving a situation in a different way. But secondly, that you see the world a specific kind of way that has its own biases, right? If I'm an extroverted feeler, then I might not want to use my introverted thinking all that much. And maybe I'm always in the feeling realm and I haven't really defined or understood maybe what I'm doing with my life. Or on the flip side, if I'm an extroverted sensing type and I'm all out there in the world, maybe I haven't really thought about the implications of my actions or what the big picture is all about. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave those in the comment section below, and I'll see you on the next one.